every community, there are rules designed to keep things orderly. But what happens when those rules become weapons, used not to protect, but to hurt? This is the story of a family's fight for dignity, respect, and the right to simply exist in their own neighborhood. Sophie, a young girl whose life has already been shaped by a disability, found herself facing an unimaginable cruelty from someone who should have been a neighbor, someone who instead became her tormentor. The woman known as Karen, a figure of authority within the Homeowners Association, HOA, wielded her position like a weapon, aiming it at Sophie and her family for the most trivial of reasons. The moment Sophie dared to cross Karen's lawn, her only mistake was existing in a space she should have been free to traverse. The HOA, Karen, took it upon herself to teach Sophie a lesson that, instead of teaching respect or boundaries, taught the family the ugly truth of how power can corrupt and how some people will stop at nothing to feel superior. What began as a typical afternoon quickly escalated into a battle for Sophie's right to feel safe in her own home. Sophie's wheelchair was more than just a tool, it was a lifeline, a reminder of the resilience she carried within her despite the challenges of daily life. But for Karen, Sophie's wheelchair was a symbol of something she could control, something she could use to exert her dominance. And when Sophie, unable to predict the storm that was coming, crossed that line, her heart was filled with nothing but the simple desire to be a part of the world around her. Little did she know, this small act of defiance would trigger a ruthless, unprovoked act of aggression. Sophie had no idea that crossing the lawn of their own neighborhood would be seen as an act of rebellion by someone who thought her personal space was more important than the well-being of others. This is where their lives changed forever. What was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful existence quickly turned into a nightmare. Sophie, with all her hopes and dreams, had to face the brutal side of the world. A world where kindness, compassion, and understanding were replaced by entitlement, prejudice, and cruelty. The power imbalance between them and Karen was undeniable, and the feeling of helplessness was suffocating. But through it all, Sophie's family had one thing that Karen could never take away: love. The bond between Sophie and her family was unbreakable, a reminder that no matter how hard Karen tried to break them, they would stand firm together. The tension between them reached a breaking point that no one could have predicted. Sophie's parents knew this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. Karen's behavior was rooted in something much darker, something deeper than mere resentment. It was power, an overpowering need to control those around her, to bend the world to her will. And in this fight for control, Sophie's safety became the ultimate prize for Karen. As Sophie sat helplessly in her wheelchair, the very thing that allowed her to move, to be independent, was attacked, not by a physical force, but by an idea that Sophie was somehow less deserving of kindness, respect, and freedom just because she was different. The idea that Karen had the right to dictate who could occupy space, to decide who was welcome, was all it took to tip the scale toward violence. The shocking truth, though, is that Sophie wasn't the only one affected. Her family, already enduring their own struggles, was now forced into a battle they never anticipated. A battle against a neighbor who saw nothing but a target in Sophie's wheelchair. And the worst part? Karen believed she was justified. This wasn't just a story of one act of cruelty, it was a story of how the small, everyday decisions of individuals can create ripples that harm the very people they should be protecting. Sophie's struggle was never meant to be a battle against the system. It was a battle for survival, for basic respect, and for her place in a world that at that moment seemed bent on excluding her. But this is not just a story of victimhood. This is a story of survival, of resilience, and of the fight to be seen for who you are, no matter the obstacles in your way. Sophie's family knew that if they didn't stand up now, if they didn't push back against the injustice that had been done to their daughter, then Karen's power would continue to grow unchecked. And so, a quiet, determined family would be forced to find their voice and fight a battle they never asked for but could no longer ignore. This is a story of what happens when the rules are used to hurt instead of heal, and how one family refuses to let the cruelty of a single neighbor define their future. As Sophie's family settled into their quiet suburban life, they never expected that their peaceful neighborhood would become the battleground for such a senseless conflict. The first whispers of trouble came from the Homeowners Association, HOA, a governing body that, while initially appearing to be just another group of well-meaning neighbors, quickly revealed itself to be a powerful force for control. At the heart of this power was Karen, an HOA member who held her position with a sense of entitlement that few could ignore. In her eyes, the rules of the HOA were not just guidelines, they were the law, and anyone who dared to challenge them was seen as a problem to be dealt with. Sophie, who had already faced challenges simply by being in a wheelchair, soon became the target of Karen's disapproval. It started small, almost unnoticeable, a comment about parking too close to the curb, a suggestion that Sophie's family wasn't following the proper decorum of the community. These were the first signs of Karen's growing irritation with the family. But what seemed trivial to others felt like a constant assault to Sophie's parents, who were already doing everything they could to provide a stable, loving environment for their daughter. Sophie, a bright, thoughtful young girl, had her own struggles to face, dealing with a disability that made even the simplest tasks more difficult than they should have been. She didn't need the added stress of feeling unwanted or unwelcome in her own neighborhood. Karen's irritation with Sophie's family grew more pronounced as time went on. Every little detail about their lives seemed to irritate her, and each complaint she filed against them grew more petty. Sophie's parents found themselves constantly on edge, not knowing if they were about to receive another letter from the HOA about an infraction they hadn't even realized they were committing. It didn't matter that they were doing their best to follow the rules. Karen's idea of perfection was nothing short of unreasonable, and she saw herself as the enforcer of this distorted vision. Sophie's challenges were amplified by Karen's behavior. Every time Sophie tried to navigate her wheelchair down the street, Karen was there, watching. At first, Sophie's parents tried to ignore her, telling themselves that Karen's complaints were just part of life in an HOA-controlled neighborhood. But when Sophie was forced to cross the lawn of a neighbor to get to the park, things took a dark turn. Karen, who had already made it clear that Sophie wasn't welcome in her part of the neighborhood, saw this as an affront to her authority. She approached Sophie with a coldness that sent a chill through the family, her words dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here," Karen said, her eyes cold and calculating. "This isn't a place for people like you." Sophie's parents were stunned, unsure of how to respond to such blatant cruelty. They had never imagined that something so simple, so innocent, could provoke such an outburst from someone they thought was just another neighbor. The HOA had always been there to maintain a sense of order, but now it seemed more like a tool for bullying, used by someone who had no interest in fostering a sense of community, only in controlling those around her. As the weeks went by, Karen's behavior only worsened. Sophie's parents tried to keep their heads down, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Every time they received another complaint from Karen, it felt like an attack on their very existence. Sophie, who had always been a bright and confident young girl, began to feel like she was the problem. She couldn't understand why Karen was singling her out, why she was being treated differently from the other children in the neighborhood. It was clear that Karen's issues weren't with the family as a whole, they were with Sophie, and her disability was the reason. One afternoon, Sophie tried to cross the lawn again, this time to retrieve a ball that had rolled onto the neighbor's yard. As she slowly maneuvered her wheelchair over the grass, Karen appeared from nowhere, her presence like a shadow looming over Sophie. "I told you before," Karen hissed, her voice venomous. "Stay off my property." Sophie, too frightened to argue, tried to back up, but her wheelchair got stuck in the grass. As she struggled to free herself, Karen's words cut through the air. "You're just too much trouble," she muttered, her eyes filled with an icy fury. Sophie's heart raced as she realized how much danger she was in. The atmosphere between Sophie's family and Karen was now one of constant tension. Sophie's parents began to feel like prisoners in their own home. Every decision they made, every action they took, was scrutinized and criticized by Karen. It wasn't enough for her to make idle complaints anymore. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to stop until Sophie and her family were driven out of the neighborhood. The breaking point was near, and Sophie's family could feel it. Karen was escalating her behavior with each passing day, becoming more unreasonable, more confrontational. And yet, Sophie's parents held onto the hope that somehow things would calm down. But deep down, they knew that Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What had started as a petty dispute over property lines had turned into something far darker, a battle for dignity, for space, and for the very right to exist without fear of being attacked. Tensions were at a boiling point, and Sophie's parents were now preparing for the inevitable. They knew that something had to change. They couldn't allow Karen's cruelty to continue unchecked. The time had come for them to stand up for their daughter, for their family, and for their right to live in peace. But as they prepared for the confrontation, they couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. The tension between Sophie's family and Karen had been building for weeks, each encounter pushing them closer to the edge. Sophie's parents, exhausted from the constant complaints and confrontations, were no longer willing to remain silent. It was clear now that Karen's disdain wasn't just a quirk of her personality, it was something deeply ingrained, a hatred masked as concern for community order. Sophie's simple existence, her wheelchair, had become a symbol of everything Karen resented. And now, Sophie's family had to make a choice: stay silent or stand up to the injustice that was being done to them. The turning point came on a quiet afternoon when Sophie's parents decided they would no longer allow Karen to dictate their lives. Sophie had asked her parents to let her go out and play with her friends in the neighborhood park, which was just across the lawn that Karen so jealously guarded. The park had always been a place of refuge for Sophie, a place where she could forget about the stares, the whispers, and the constant tension in the air. It was supposed to be her sanctuary, but this time, crossing that lawn was going to be different. Sophie didn't know it, but this simple decision would set off a chain of events that would change everything. As Sophie slowly maneuvered her wheelchair toward the lawn, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had crossed this path countless times before, but today, something felt different. Her hands gripped the wheels tightly, her body tense with anticipation. As she made her way over the grass, her heart began to race. She could hear footsteps behind her, the unmistakable sound of Karen's heels crunching against the ground. Sophie's parents had always warned her to be cautious around Karen, but Sophie was determined not to let the woman intimidate her any longer. She had every right to be there, just as much as anyone else. Then it happened. Without warning, Karen stormed onto the lawn, her face twisted in fury. Sophie barely had time to react before Karen's harsh voice cut through the air like a blade. "I told you to stay off my property." Karen screamed, her words dripping with venom. Sophie froze, her body going rigid. She had expected an argument, maybe even a few harsh words, but nothing like this. Karen was in her face now, her anger palpable, her eyes full of contempt. Sophie's parents, who had been watching from the porch, rushed forward, but they were too late. Before they could reach her, Karen made a sudden move, her foot connecting with the back of Sophie's wheelchair. It was a swift, unexpected action that sent Sophie tumbling to the ground. The impact was brutal, and Sophie cried out in pain as she hit the dirt. Her wheelchair, the one thing that allowed her to move through the world, lay abandoned beside her. Sophie's parents reached her just as Karen stood there, her chest heaving with rage. The look on her face was cold, calculating. She wasn't just angry, she was enjoying the power she held over Sophie. "You're nothing but trouble," Karen spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here. This is my space, and you'll learn to stay out of it." Sophie's father, usually a calm and collected man, felt his blood boil with a rage he had never known. He rushed to Sophie's side, lifting her from the ground with as much care as he could. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His daughter had been hurt, physically and emotionally, and there was nothing he could have done to prevent it. Sophie's mother, equally distraught, stood beside them, her face pale with shock and disbelief. How had they gotten here? How had their peaceful life turned into this nightmare? As Sophie was helped back into her wheelchair, her mother's eyes locked with Karen's. There was a fierce determination in them now. "You've gone too far, Karen," Sophie's mother said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "This is our home. You have no right to treat us this way." But Karen only sneered. "Oh, I have every right," she replied, her tone dripping with arrogance. "I've been dealing with people like you for years. You think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want, but I'm not having it. You're not welcome here, and I'll make sure of it." The words stung. But Sophie's parents knew this wasn't just about one woman's bitterness, it was about a system that allowed people like Karen to operate unchecked. The HOA, once thought to be a force for community, had become a tool for oppression, wielded by someone who thought she had the power to decide who could and couldn't live in the neighborhood. Sophie's father clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "We will not let you treat our daughter this way. Not now, not ever." Karen laughed, the sound harsh and unsettling. "Do your worst," she sneered. "You can't stop me. The HOA is on my side. You're nothing more than a nuisance." The confrontation left Sophie and her family shaken, but it also solidified their resolve. Sophie's parents knew that they couldn't back down now, not when their daughter's safety was at risk. They would fight back, not just for Sophie, but for the rights of everyone who had ever been bullied or oppressed in the name of community order. The battle for their home, their dignity, and their daughter's future had only just begun, and they were prepared to face whatever came next. The anger that burned inside them was no longer just about one incident. It was about standing up to injustice, about fighting for a world where everyone, regardless of their abilities, could live freely and without fear. This was more than a confrontation. It was the beginning of a movement, one that would push back against Karen's toxic control and stand up for what was right. Sophie's family wasn't going to let her wheelchair, her disability, or the malicious actions of one woman define their lives. This fight was just getting started, and they weren't going to back down. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Sophie's family found themselves in a state of shock and disbelief. The peaceful life they had once known was now in shambles, shattered by the cruel actions of their neighbor, Karen. Sophie, who had already faced immense challenges due to her disability, now had to grapple with the emotional and physical consequences of what had happened. Her parents, who had always protected her with unwavering love and care, now felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, questioning if they had done enough to shield their daughter from the cruelty of the world. The immediate aftermath was one of pain and confusion. Sophie, though physically unharmed beyond a few scrapes and bruises, was emotionally devastated. The confidence she had built over the years, facing the daily challenges of living with a disability, was now shaken. The realization that someone in her own neighborhood, someone with power over their lives, saw her as a burden, a problem to be dealt with, was a blow that left her questioning her place in the world. Her parents, too, were grappling with the weight of what had transpired. The violence that had been unleashed on their daughter was not just a physical act. It was a symbol of the deeper injustice that existed in their community. Sophie's father, whose protective instincts had been ignited during the confrontation, now found himself fighting a battle he hadn't prepared for. Karen's actions weren't just an isolated incident. They were part of a broader culture of exclusion that was allowed to thrive under the guise of community regulations. As he sat beside Sophie, helping her clean the dirt from her knees, he couldn't shake the anger and disbelief that bubbled up inside him. He knew they couldn't let this go. Karen's behavior needed to be addressed, not only for Sophie's sake, but for the sake of everyone in the neighborhood who had been quietly suffering under her oppressive rule. Sophie's mother, equally devastated, spent hours on the phone with lawyers and neighbors trying to figure out how to best approach the situation. The more she spoke with people, the more she realized how widespread Karen's cruelty had been. She wasn't just targeting Sophie, she was using her position within the HOA to intimidate anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of what the neighborhood should look like. Sophie's mother couldn't understand how a system that was meant to foster a sense of community could be so easily twisted into a tool for discrimination and control. The neighbors, who had once been friendly but distant, were now forced to pick sides. Some expressed support, offering kind words and gestures of solidarity. Others, however, were silent, afraid to speak out against Karen, whose influence within the HOA was well established. The divide in the community became more apparent as Sophie's family realized just how much power Karen had wielded over the years. Her control wasn't just over lawns and property lines, it was over people's lives, their sense of safety, and their ability to live without fear of judgment or persecution. In the days that followed, Sophie's family was inundated with complaints from the HOA, each one more trivial than the last. It seemed as though Karen had made it her mission to wear them down, to find any excuse to punish them for defying her. The pressure was mounting, and Sophie's parents felt the weight of it on their shoulders. But despite the relentless barrage of complaints, Sophie's parents refused to back down. They knew that if they didn't stand up to Karen now, things would only get worse. They had to make a choice: continue to live in fear or fight for the dignity and respect that every human being deserved. As the days turned into weeks, the emotional toll on Sophie was undeniable. She had always been a sensitive soul, and the trauma of the encounter with Karen had left a mark on her that would take time to heal. She no longer felt safe crossing the lawn, and even the thought of leaving the house filled her with dread. Sophie's mother noticed her daughter's reluctance to go outside, her avoidance of the park where she had once loved to play. It was clear that the psychological impact of Karen's cruelty was just as damaging as the physical incident itself. But Sophie's parents weren't ready to let her retreat into fear. They knew that if they didn't push back, if they didn't show Sophie that there was a way to stand up against injustice, they would be letting Karen win. They began researching their options, consulting with legal experts, and seeking advice from others who had dealt with similar HOA conflicts. The more they learned, the more they realized just how much power the HOA had to make changes within the community. They could fight back, and they would. At the same time, Sophie's father began to reach out to other residents in the neighborhood, people who had been silently suffering under Karen's reign. He knew that they weren't the only ones who had been targeted by her. There were others, people with disabilities, people of different backgrounds, families who had been forced to comply with Karen's unreasonable demands simply to keep the peace. It was time for the community to unite, to stand together against the oppression that had been allowed to flourish for far too long. As the legal process began to unfold, Sophie's family started to regain their sense of hope. The fight was far from over, but they knew that they were no longer alone. The support from their neighbors, from those who had witnessed Karen's actions and had quietly suffered in the background, was becoming a powerful force. Together, they began to challenge the HOA's leadership, demanding that changes be made to prevent further abuse and that Karen be held accountable for her actions. Though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, Sophie's parents were more determined than ever to fight for their daughter's future. They had learned a painful lesson: that in a world where power is often abused, silence only perpetuates injustice. Sophie's journey was far from over, but with the support of her family and the community, she was ready to reclaim her sense of safety and dignity. The consequences of Karen's actions had yet to be fully realized, but Sophie's family was prepared to ensure that she would never be subjected to such cruelty again. The aftermath of the confrontation with Karen had left Sophie's family shaken, but it had also ignited a fire within them, a determination to fight back against the injustice they had endured. Sophie's parents knew that they couldn't simply let this go. They couldn't allow Karen's actions to go unchallenged. The emotional toll on Sophie had been immense, but it was the idea of standing up for her, of giving her the voice she deserved, that began to drive them forward. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about making sure their daughter would never have to face such cruelty again. And it wasn't just about Sophie. It was about standing up for everyone who had been mistreated, silenced, or ignored by those in positions of power. The turning point came when Sophie's father, after days of researching their legal options, finally found a lawyer who was willing to take on their case. It was a moment of hope, but also one of realization. This battle would be long and it would be hard. The HOA, with all its resources, was a formidable opponent. But the more Sophie's family learned about the law, about their rights as residents, the more they realized that Karen's behavior wasn't just morally wrong, it was illegal. Sophie's father knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight, but he also knew that it was the right one. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for every person who had ever been bullied, pushed down, or discriminated against in the name of community rules. The first step was to gather evidence. Sophie's parents knew that they couldn't simply rely on their word alone. They needed proof of Karen's abusive behavior. So, they began documenting every interaction, every letter from the HOA, every instance where Karen had overstepped her bounds. They took photographs of the lawn, recorded conversations, and reached out to neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation. They began building a case, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been quietly enduring Karen's tyranny. But the evidence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. Sophie's parents began to realize that they couldn't let the legal battle define their fight. They needed to ensure that Sophie's voice was heard, that her story was told, not just in the courtroom, but in their community. They reached out to others who had suffered at the hands of the HOA, looking for those who had been too afraid to speak up. It was time for a united front, and they weren't going to stand alone. As the days passed, Sophie's parents found themselves getting more involved in the HOA's meetings and activities. They had always kept a low profile before, not wanting to rock the boat. But now they saw firsthand how much power the HOA had over their lives and how little accountability it held. The more they learned about the inner workings of the HOA, the more they realized how Karen had manipulated the system to suit her needs. She wasn't just a rogue member, she was a symptom of a much larger problem. The HOA had become a tool for those who wanted to wield power, a system where those with the loudest voices and the most influence got to dictate the lives of others. Sophie's parents began to organize. They knew they needed more than just legal action. They needed to rally the support of the community to show that they weren't alone. They started attending neighborhood meetings, reaching out to other residents who had been silently suffering under the weight of Karen's control. Slowly but surely, they began to build a coalition of neighbors who were ready to take action. The more they spoke with others, the more they learned how widespread Karen's influence was. She had used her position to bully and intimidate not just Sophie's family, but many others who had dared to challenge her authority. But as they gathered support, they also had to deal with the constant pressure from the HOA. Every day seemed to bring new complaints, new attacks on their family, and the stress was mounting. Sophie's mother began to feel the weight of the battle on her shoulders. There were moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether they could really take down Karen and the entire HOA, but every time she looked at Sophie, she knew there was no turning back. They had to keep going. They had to fight for a world where Sophie could live freely, where no one was ever treated the way they had been. The turning point came during one particularly tense HOA meeting. Sophie's family had gathered with a group of neighbors ready to confront Karen and the rest of the HOA board about the ongoing abuse. It was a nerve-wracking moment, the kind of meeting where everything could change in an instant. As they sat in the room, waiting for the meeting to begin, Sophie's father looked around at the faces of those who had joined them. They were all people who had suffered, who had been silenced by fear or intimidation. But today, they were ready to speak out. When the meeting began, Sophie's father stood up, his voice steady but firm. "We're here today because we refuse to remain silent," he said, his words echoing in the room. "My family has been targeted, and we will not let this go unnoticed. We are not just fighting for our rights, we are fighting for the rights of everyone in this neighborhood who has been intimidated, manipulated, or silenced by those in power." The room fell silent as Sophie's father spoke, but when he finished, something remarkable happened. One by one, people began to speak up. They shared their stories, their experiences, their pain. The floodgates had opened, and Karen's once iron grip on the neighborhood was beginning to loosen. In that moment, Sophie's family realized that they weren't fighting this battle alone. They had the support of their community, the power of truth, and the strength of their love for Sophie. This was no longer just about them. It was about everyone who had ever felt marginalized, ignored, or oppressed. And together, they were going to make sure that Karen's abuse came to an end. The fight for justice was far from over, but Sophie's family now had a plan. They were no longer powerless victims, they were empowered advocates, ready to take on the system that had allowed Karen's cruelty to flourish. And they would not stop until justice was served. The road to justice had been long and fraught with obstacles, but Sophie's family had reached the point of no return. With the support of their neighbors, a solid legal case, and the unshakable determination to right the wrongs done to them, they were ready for the final showdown. This was it, the moment when Karen's reign of terror would either come to an end or continue unchecked. The stakes were higher than ever, and Sophie's family knew that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The battle had started as a personal fight for Sophie's dignity and safety, but it had grown into something much bigger. It was a fight for everyone in the neighborhood who had ever been silenced or oppressed by the HOA's unyielding control. The support from the community was overwhelming, but the resistance was equally fierce. Karen, as expected, was prepared to do everything in her power to protect her position and maintain her influence. But what she didn't realize was that Sophie's family, once quiet and hesitant, had now become a force to be reckoned with. The final confrontation took place in the very heart of the HOA's power, its annual meeting where key decisions were made and where the fate of the neighborhood's residents was decided. Sophie's parents had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had carefully crafted their arguments, gathered testimonies from witnesses, and gathered undeniable proof of Karen's abuse. They were no longer just a family fighting for their daughter. They were the voice of every person who had been oppressed by the system Karen had helped build. The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting began. The HOA members sat in their usual positions, Karen at the head of a table, her expression one of cold indifference. But this time, things were different. Sophie's family wasn't intimidated. They weren't afraid to speak up, to fight for what was right. As Sophie's father stood to address the room, the weight of the moment settled over him. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for everything they had lost and everything they hoped to gain. I'm standing here today because my daughter, Sophie, deserves the same rights as every other person in this neighborhood. Sophie's father began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened to her, the cruelty she endured at the hands of one person, cannot be swept under the rug. It's not just about us. It's about every family that's been bullied, every person who's been treated like they don't belong. We're here to make sure that Karen's actions are held accountable. We're here to make sure that no one else ever has to go through what we went through. The room fell silent as Sophie's father's words sank in. One by one, the other residents who had joined the cause stood up to speak, sharing their own stories of intimidation, fear, and discrimination at the hands of Karen. They spoke of the harassment, the false accusations, and the emotional toll Karen's behavior had taken on their lives. And with each story, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The once loyal supporters of Karen began to waver. They couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Karen's actions had crossed a line that could no longer be tolerated. Karen, however, was not easily swayed. She sat with her arms crossed, her face twisted in defiance. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "I have done nothing wrong. All I've ever tried to do is keep this neighborhood orderly. You're all just looking for someone to blame for your own failures." But her words fell flat. The evidence against her was undeniable. Sophie's parents had compiled everything: witness testimonies, photographic evidence, and even video footage of the confrontation that had started it all. The more Karen tried to defend herself, the more she exposed her true nature. She wasn't just a concerned homeowner. She was a bully, using her position of power to harm those she deemed beneath her. As the meeting continued, the emotions in the room reached a boiling point. Sophie's mother stood to speak, her voice shaking with both anger and resolve. Karen, you've used your position to make our lives a living hell. You've made my daughter feel unsafe in her own home, in her own neighborhood. You've tried to tear us apart, but we're not going to let you. This isn't just about a lawn or a wheelchair. It's about respect. It's about our right to live without fear. You've taken that from us, but you will not take our spirit. The crowd erupted into applause. It was a moment of victory, of reclaiming their power. The support for Sophie's family was overwhelming, and Karen, for the first time, looked unsure of herself. The walls she had built around her power were crumbling. Her arrogance, her cruelty, it was all on display for everyone to see. And in that moment, it was clear that Sophie's family had won. Not just the battle, but the war. The final vote came down swiftly. The HOA members, now fully aware of the extent of Karen's abuse, voted overwhelmingly to remove her from her position. Karen's influence had been shattered, her power stripped away. As the result was announced, Sophie's parents stood side by side, their faces a mixture of relief and triumph. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for every person who had ever been oppressed by the system, for every person who had ever felt invisible, unheard, or unimportant. Sophie, sitting quietly beside her parents, felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The weight of the conflict had lifted, and though the scars of the past would take time to heal, she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer a victim. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for her place in the world. And she had won. As the meeting ended, Sophie's family left the room, their heads held high. The battle was over, but the journey was far from finished. They knew that their fight for justice had only just begun, but now they had the strength, the courage, and the community to face whatever came next. They had proven that even in the face of cruelty and power, love, resilience, and unity could prevail. And that ultimately was the greatest victory of all. The aftermath of Karen's removal from the HOA and the subsequent changes in the neighborhood were nothing short of transformative for Sophie's family. The victory, while hard-earned and bittersweet, brought them a sense of relief that had been long overdue. Sophie, once again, felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. She no longer had to look over her shoulder every time she left the house, wondering if she would encounter the woman who had made her life so difficult. For the first time in months, Sophie's family could breathe freely, knowing that their fight for justice had been successful and that they had reclaimed control over their lives. The community, too, began to change. Karen's influence, which had once been a suffocating presence, was now gone. The HOA, which had once been a tool for her oppression, now faced a critical reassessment. The residents, inspired by the courage of Sophie's family, came together to ensure that the HOA would no longer be a platform for the kinds of abuses Karen had perpetuated. They formed a new committee, one that was focused on inclusion, fairness, and mutual respect. Sophie's family, along with several of their neighbors, took an active role in shaping the future of the community, ensuring that no one else would have to face the same kind of tyranny they had experienced. As Sophie's parents looked back on the journey they had taken, they saw it as one of incredible emotional growth. The ordeal had tested their patience, their strength, and their love for each other. They had faced doubt and fear at every turn, unsure if they could truly make a difference in the face of such overwhelming opposition. But through it all, they had found a wellspring of courage they never knew they had. Their daughter had become their greatest source of strength. It was for Sophie, and for others like her, that they had fought so tirelessly. And now, they could finally see the fruits of their labor. Sophie, for her part, had grown in ways that were beyond her parents' wildest hopes. The girl who had once been afraid to leave her home, who had been forced to shrink back from life in fear of the world around her, had blossomed into someone who knew her worth. The pain and fear that had once consumed her were still present, but they no longer held the same power over her. She had faced a formidable enemy and had come out stronger on the other side. More importantly, she had learned that her voice mattered, that she didn't have to stay silent in the face of injustice. And that lesson would stay with her for the rest of her life. But the journey wasn't without its scars. The emotional toll that the conflict had taken on Sophie and her family couldn't simply be erased with the stroke of a legal victory. Sophie still struggled with the memories of that day. The fear, the humiliation, and the feeling that she was somehow less than everyone else because of her disability. Her parents, too, had their moments of doubt. They questioned if they had done enough, if they had protected Sophie in the way they should have from the very beginning. But through therapy and the support of their community, they began to heal slowly but surely. It was Sophie's mother who took the lead in ensuring that the family could move forward. She understood that healing wasn't a quick fix. It was a process that required time, patience, and understanding. Sophie, with the help of her parents and her newfound circle of friends, began to reclaim her confidence. She returned to the park, the place that had once been a source of anxiety, and played with her friends without fear. She even began speaking at community events, sharing her story, and encouraging others to stand up for themselves in the face of adversity. As for Karen, the aftermath of her removal from the HOA was far from kind. The community's disapproval of her actions spread quickly, and her influence over the neighborhood dwindled to nothing. The damage she had caused, however, could not be undone. She had left a trail of resentment and fear that would take time to heal. Karen's reputation, once solid and revered, was shattered beyond repair. She had been exposed for who she truly was, a bully hiding behind a mask of authority. But while she had lost her position, Sophie's family knew that Karen's character was the true casualty. Power, they had learned, was a fragile thing, and it could be taken away as quickly as it was gained. As Sophie's family settled into their new reality, they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had not only stood up for themselves, but they had also inspired a community to take action. They had shown the neighborhood what it meant to fight for what was right, no matter the odds. And in doing so, they had created a ripple effect that would continue for years to come. Sophie's journey, though difficult, had changed the course of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. However, even as the dust settled, Sophie's family knew that the work was far from over. The community had come together to create a better environment, but they understood that this kind of change required constant vigilance. They continued to participate in HOA meetings, making sure that the values of inclusion and respect remained at the forefront of every decision. They worked with local organizations to provide support for others facing similar challenges, and they advocated for disability rights and greater accessibility in their neighborhood. And yet, the shadow of the past remained. While they had won this battle, they understood that there were always more fights to be fought, more injustices to right, more voices to lift. Sophie's family knew that, as long as there were people like Karen out there, their work would never truly be finished. But for now, they could take solace in the fact that they had made a difference. They had proven that even in the face of immense adversity, love, resilience, and community could triumph over hate and oppression. As they moved forward, Sophie's family held onto one important lesson. No matter how many obstacles they faced, they would always have each other. And with that unwavering support, they knew they could overcome anything. The journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next. If you want to hear more stories of everyday heroes standing up against injustice, fighting for what's right, and overcoming insurmountable odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more heart-stopping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, only on HOA Denied Access. Don't miss out. Join the movement and be part of the change.